Hello, everyone. I'm not sure I need the microphone. Um, my name is Janine Culligan. I'm the director of the Eleanor D. Wilson Museum, and I just want to thank you so much for coming tonight. Also, I want to thank Carolyn Maslumi for letting the Eleanor D. Wilson Museum borrow a selection of her 24 amazing quilts from her collection. We're so delighted to have them here and to share them with the Hollins campus in the Roanoke region. Originally, Karen Maslumi was to Zoom in with us tonight. Unfortunately, she has had a serious medical emergency. Carolyn suggested we contact her colleague, Lamerchi Frazier, to give the talk. And fortunately, Lamerchi is here with us tonight, and really at the 11th hour, she stepped in, and we're so grateful for that. The title of the talk is the same. It's Surviving Blackness in America, Quilts as Political Statement. Lamerchi will talk for approximately 40 minutes and then take questions. Following her Zoom talk, the museum will be open, so you'll have a chance to see the quilts if you haven't seen them. And also there will be a reception in the hallway. And now I want to give you a brief bio of Lamerchi Frazier. She's an accomplished visual activist, public artist, historian, educator, and poet. She's a member of Women of Color Network Quilters, founded by Dr. Carolyn Maslumi. She currently serves as the Executive Director of Creative and Strategic Planning for Spoke Arts Incorporated, having previously served as Director of Education and Interpretation for the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. Additionally, she holds the role of Director of Creative Engagement for the Transformative Action Project, Violence Transformed. Frazier's innovative art focuses on supporting social and restorative justice, as well as the pursuit of civil and human rights through a lens of 500 years of Black and Indigenous history. Her one life work is Save Me From My Amnesia, is identified by a call to action to remember, reclaim, restore, and reimagine. Her public art mirrors and engages with the community. She is a fellow of the Boston Foundation's Brother Thomas program. Frazier also serves as a member of the City of Boston's Mayor's Reparations Task Force. Her residencies in Brazil, Taiwan, Costa Rica, Africa, France, and Cuba have all featured public community projects. Her works are permanently housed in esteemed institutions such as the Smithsonian, the White House, Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the Dallas Museum of Art. Frazier additionally serves as a Massachusetts State's Arts Commissioner and was recently awarded the 2023 Boston Celtics Heroes Among Us Award. Her interviews of authors for WGBH and the Boston Public Library include Claudia Rankin, Dr. Margaret Burnham, Ibram X. Kendi, Patrice Cullors, Tamara Payne, and other literary and visual artists. Her poetry is now published in the anthology Wheatley at 250, Black Women Poets Reimagine the Verse of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. And so I hope we can give a nice welcome to Lamerchi Frazier.
Well, my goodness, thank you, Janine. It is indeed my honor to be here with you and be invited by the Eleanor D. Museum on Hollis University's campus. Given this show that is a great exhibition, possible for many reasons, but most of all, through the arduous work of Dr. Carolyn Maslumi. So it is indeed my honor and privilege and opportunity to be with you tonight to share some thoughts about your brave exhibition that is there and courageous efforts in these really tumultuous times that we're living in. Roanoke is a place of very special significance to me and my family on my mother's side. I have relatives who still live in Roanoke, Virginia, and Virginia as a place of my own upbringing is very special to me. So thank you for allowing me to come in. I really am very grateful for the honor that Dr. Carolyn Maslomi has afforded me. And so tonight, I would like to engage everyone as if we're in everybody's living room and we're having this discussion to relax and be with me as we journey through what is a very great portion of the collection of Dr. Carolyn Maslomi. I would like to bring up my slides now, if I may, to share with you this very unique visit to not only the exhibition, but to what has made it absolutely necessary for us to be here. So I just want to thank you all while I am bringing up this slide. And I revisited some of what I had presented as a title, and I'm calling it African American Quilts from the Collection of Carolyn Maslomi, which is the name of the exhibit. I want to also put the byline here that cloth stories make the living, breathing Black aesthetic. And this is going to be a part of our journey tonight. I would like to make a land acknowledgement that we recognize the land that we stand on as traditional indigenous territory of the Roanoke Nation, who continue through their lineal descendants. We acknowledge the land. We recognize these and other indigenous groups as our hosts, and we agree to be their good guests. And that brings us to the point of looking at our shared history of over 500 years, how we occupy the space, and that our stories are in the land and water. If we look at our sojourn on the earth that brought us through the Middle Passage, we look back to the waters of the Nile, the ancient civilizations, the buildings that were there, and the map here presented of Africa. I like to point out that it is our ancestral land and give acknowledgement to that land also. As we journey through what is our plight tonight, we have to understand that the arrival of African descended people was across an Atlantic Ocean, mostly on the Gold Coast of Africa, and that there was in this Middle Passage an oceanic temporality of the water that presented this question: where are we going? What are we going to do? And we know that this was a part of what was the institution of slavery, that there was the transatlantic slave trade that actually informed our journey here as we arrived on the shores of America in several different points, distinctly here in Boston, where I am, 1638, distinctly in Richmond, Virginia, 1619. And the ships that we arrived on, there is a diagram at the right corner at the bottom of this slide that shows how those spoon-like arrangements in that diagram were how the Africans were transported. The map above it shows the triangular trade routes that took us from the west coast of Africa into South America, into North America, and into the European continent. Recognizing that this was the part of what we were going to face, we had to look at this idea of property and what that meant as the Western Hemisphere was being developed based on enslaved labor, and how the relationships to that land actually happened. We look at this white possessive logic that many people call white supremacy, but I like to think about it as a way people were thinking about race. And those that were kidnapping kidnapping people and looking at the land as a part of what they were going to possess are those who owned property. And then there were those who were being disposed of their property, the indigenous people. And then there were those who were being deemed property. And those are the African people. And it took all of what we are discussing to build America as a nation. So indeed, the stories that we are going to look at have a lot to do with the impact of that slavery on this nation for over 400 years. When we look at one of the principal architects of the Declaration of Independence, we're looking at Thomas Jefferson. And in his notes on the state of Virginia, I would like to bring out that one of his purported statements was that people of African descent or Blacks have no reasoning power and no imagination. Tonight, we intend to make that be something that is false. We want to look at how African Americans have been read in this country and how it promotes this this very special effort to bring into view the history and the culture and the beauty of Black people here. Africa has been read in many times as the ugly in relationship to Europe, the beautiful. What we have had the intention of doing, and Dr. Maslomi participates in this cauldron, is turning that up on its head and saying that we want to be found at the limits of beauty, that we want to contrast what Mr. Jefferson has said and what others are saying as a false notion that we are living, existing, breathing beauty as a Black aesthetic. Why this dominant master narrative that is referred to by Dr. Maslomi has to be interrupted is that we will, in these quilts, we will reveal the hidden stories that expand American history's narrative, that give us the opportunity to bring us into one place and look at justice and equality and freedom in its true sense. Dr. Maslomi says when one faction of American society is excluded from the master narrative of our collective histories, the whole society loses. So in her masterful way, she is able to help us understand why she founded in 1985 the Women of Color Quilters organization to foster and preserve the art of quilt making among women of color. There are also 5 men, by the way, currently in the membership of the organization. But as Dr. Maslomi went to quilt shows, she saw no representation of people of color in those exhibitions as she went earlier than 1985. But she knew that there had to be some positioning of us in this contribution to the art of quilting. And so when we look at race and representation, she was truly in that continuum of highlighting jazz and quilting as true forms of American art. And she intentionally and deliberately presented a new focus on quilting in the Western canon of art. Her intentionality was also witnessed in the number of books. I have some listed here: Spirit of the Cloth, Textural Rhythms, Visioning Human Rights, and Still We Rise, Journey of Hope, We Who Believe in Freedom, Quilting African Americans' Women's History, just to name a few, in her intentional desire to build this community of African descendant quilters who would make this statement, just as been built in the Harlem Renaissance as a cultural and art movement on into the Black Power era as a cultural and art movement. Dr. Maslomi used quilts as this vehicle to tell the history that has not been focused on. I would like to say that in addition to her being an engineer, a NASA engineer, that she, in her might and her intelligence and in her wisdom, has built such an organization of recognition and in her work that she has been awarded the highest accomplished merit in America, called the National Heritage Fellow. Dr. Maslomi featured here among items in her collection, and with one of her favorite quilts, because she loves black and white quilts that she makes, is an outstanding example of one who does not give up, one who has persevered, and one who has been responsible for us being able to have this wonderful exhibition at Hollins University. And as we look at what she was involved in and what others are involved in, and how quilts participate in race and representation here, they not only do that, but they participate in a visible history as visible art, and in some ways present what we have as principles of visible democracy. A relationship of what is being seen is that which is perceptible with our senses of sight. It tells us that there is something apparent, that there is something manifest. And it has usually, in this kind of historical record, a methodical art as document presence. So quilts, in their visibility, are telling these stories, not on paper, but in cloth. They are helping us to consider that there is a very special story and cultural heritage of Black Americans that is evident in the spaces that we know and the deliberate messages that we look at and foster through this cloth, through this, what I see as a talking cloth. And what Toni Morrison says, that as we tell our stories, we need to be away from the white gaze, because only we can tell our own stories. So as we expand the American archive of history, we want to put these quilts in a position to do what maybe paper cannot do. As Dr. Maslomi refers to quilts as this place of having soft landings for hard issue. I think that's so appropriate to talk about this way of bringing beauty that kind of seduces you to come in to these quilt stories. And then you realize sometimes it's hard history, but it helps us in this way because we're familiar with the cloth from the beginning of our lives to the end of our lives. We are familiar with that substance. And so it's not so hard to relate to it. And what we think of in the word of aesthetics is the word beauty. And in this beauty, we are able to grapple with, maybe even coming up with some solutions for our societal problems, or at least critically thinking through, or at least having a conversation. So we want to underscore how these quilt artists that are in this show today imagine, create, and perform their works of art, and how the people who come and see it can enjoy it. So Dr. Maslomi's work as a scholar, as a collector, has been able to have the wisdom to bring into her collection powerful voices in a variety of mediums that celebrate achievements of artists, poets, adventurers, movements. Look at harm reduction. Look at what is a voice of people to bring their humanity to make a better world in these quilts that she collects. So tonight we have a selected few of those artists who are in this exhibition that I'd like to share with you. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to, as we end our discussion, to ask questions about anything that you've seen or thought about while we're discussing what these wonderful quilt artists have provided for us as a format of their work. Here, featured in the beginning of what is a African-American quilt tradition, we know that in the 18th and 19th century, there were women who came together in quilting bees and other kind of configurations to take discarded cloth, to put a filling in it, and to hand sew these items that would make a covering for keeping someone warm. And the reuse of these fabrics, particularly looking at how laborious it was to produce a piece of cloth in that time. In the 18th and 19th century, there was spinning, there was weaving that had to be done to have a piece of cloth. That cloth was precious. And so with the advance of the industry of textiles through slave labor, we know that women were gathering together and taking their skills and whittling away their time at night by being together, being able to sew these quilts as items for use in their lives. And passing down these skills from one generation to the other was another process that happened. With the case of Harriet Powers, who is featured here on the left, she is one of the very well-documented women through the works of researchers like Kyra Hicks and others who have uncovered her as a formerly enslaved girl in Clark County, Georgia. She's born in 1837, and she has learned from her aunts and other people the art of quilting. She was a very religious person, and she marks in her quilts some of the tremendous moments of her life in the cosmic universe even. But more importantly, as a spiritually based woman, she depended on the stories of the Bible, and she wanted to share those with other people. And so the quilts that have been collected, and there are two of them, of Harriet Powers, are in the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and in the Smithsonian National Museum. Harriet was a very thoughtful woman, and we can see from the hands that she used to tell these stories in the block style fashion here of universal events, of stars exploding, of fish that are present in one of her blocks. I'd like to say that the second block from the top of the quilt on the left has a banded fish, which tells us something about her memory and what has been passed down to her about the sojourn across the Middle Passage. For that same banded fish is present in the quilts that are made in a place called Dahomey on the African continent. What is marvelous about these quilts of Harriet's is that they document the thinking and the critical display that is a permanent place in the canon that speaks to our understanding of universal order, of biblical scripture, and of our presence. It helps us to occupy the spaces intellectually and with the skill of the craft. Peggy Hartwell was so enamored by the quilts of Harriet Powers that she decided to make a quilt called the Ode to Harriet Powers. In that quilt, you will see that she also took from and was inspired by the actual blocks of Harriet Powers' quilts. And her stories reflect her interpretation of what Harriet presented. Not only that, but she presents from this photograph a likeness of Harriet herself. And when she talked about this quilt, one of the things that she said about it is that she wanted so much for other people to know Harriet Powers that she wanted this quilt to be exhibited over and over and over and over again. And then she said, in her intention of doing this, she thought that Harriet should be received by many people so they would know of her work and her legacy and her contribution. And importantly, she said, I made the quilt with the knowledge that it might be the closest I would ever get to place a tombstone on her grave, the search for which sparked my initial research. Fortunately for Peggy, Dr. Carolyn Maslomy mounted a campaign to place a tombstone on the unmarked grave of Harriet Powers. And this was accomplished this year. So Peggy can rest assured that she, I, and other quilters made sure that this woman would not be forgotten. Through the guidance and the wisdom of Dr. Maslomy, this has been accomplished. And I am sure that Peggy is well pleased. I'd like to introduce you to the work of Betty Ford Smith, who is from Sebring, Florida. I had an opportunity to meet Betty, and her personality is much like her quilts, very layered, very beautiful, very vibrant. In this exhibition, we can see that this very circular hand-pieced quilt is quite an accomplishment. It is very large in its presence, but more importantly, it is a part of the tradition of quilting that is not necessarily seen as art, but is art. It is in its concentric circles. It reminds us of the symbolism of universal order, of things that are circling around each other. And what is so important about this quilt is that Betty shares that she was actually taught this pine burr quilting tradition through a woman who was 92 years old, Arlene Dennis. She called her Miss Sue, who was with her in Sebring, Florida. And so as she shared that she spends many nights crafting these quilts, it is therapeutic. It is a work of art that is tremendously comforting. Not only that, in its abstraction, there are things that one can bring to this quilt and have the viewer itself can have a discussion that may not be what Betty intended even, but what is a surprising result of the impact of her work on those who are looking at it. We come to the work here of the uncovering stories, these uncovered stories that this quilt exhibition brings to us. And one of them is on my left here is Cynthia Lockhart's quilt she's from Cincinnati, Ohio, the same place Dr. Maslomy hails from. And she's named this quilt we see Levi Coffin, president of the Underground Railroad. I want to say something about Cynthia. She is a person who has been in the fashion industry in New York, who has participated in a major fashion house, who is a clothing designer, is a designer of great accomplishment, and usually works in leather and other mixed media. And as we see this quilt that she's created about Levi Coffin, she has made it so that we could actually see some of the places that he has made as Underground Railroad spaces in Indiana and across the country in his network of Underground Railroad activity that we know happened in the 19th century. His started around 1826. His adhesion to the safety of people who were trying to escape slavery led him to assist 3,300 people in his lifetime. And he is said to have not ever had anyone lost during those journeys. So as an avid conductor of the Underground Railroad, what Cynthia has done is given his life feature and highlight in her mapping of these spaces in a very unusual technique of these circular places where you can see featured elements of design as she has bound them, she's worked them. This is a cotton quilt, but it is so well executed that it leads us to want to know more about this man that God called Levi Coffin and his quest to help others to get the freedom. Stunning quilt. Now, at the right here, we have a quilt by Marion Coleman, who hailed from Castro Valley, California. Marion, and she is not with us anymore, but she is with us in her spirit, has been one who was in the space of memory. Her work in the cloth reached people through helping them to unmind their memories, to mind them and come to a point where they could be shared. I remember Marion talking about even a postcard project that helped others to send messages across geographic spaces that were in cloth, that had been quilted, and that this was a memory project. In the quilt we see here that is in the exhibition, Waiting for the Freedom Train, it is honoring memory once again. It is honoring those who are waiting for safety and passage. Much of what African American history presents is movement. And as people move across these spaces that are mapped by the quilts that we're seeing, there is intention and purpose on gaining a space to be safe, to have a space of justice, to have a space of building and rebuilding and repurposing their lives. And so in this quilt, we see people who Marion has grandly depicted here, a family with a baby, a child sitting at the base of a mother and possibly a grandmother, that this is an extraordinary scene of family life and of waiting and of moment and of movement. Edjanetta Miller on the left here has blessed us with a quilt. She's from Hartford, Connecticut, called Promised Land. When Edjanetta speaks about herself, she says that she was born in Greensboro, North Carolina. And as a child, she witnessed many things that those of us who grew up in the Jim Crow South under the law of segregation would have seen and witnessed, and would have then been inspired to someday make those things disappear if we could. So in this quilt, as Edjanetta speaks to the Promised Land, she has depicted in photo transfer of documents and images, a trail for us to look at of different places where justice is to be had. She's pointing to a south and a north and directional spaces in this wonderful quilt that is a quilt of power in its color scheme of red, black, and white, featuring documents that you have to read, that you have to get in close to. It is a work of art. We are very, very privileged to see and have in this collection of Dr. Maslumi's. And it leads us to why she may have collected it in the first place. That it is an honor to be able to unearth these stories, to see photographs of people who are migrating in the Great Migration, who are taking all that they have with them, their belongings, moving from a southern agricultural economy to an urban north and industrial place, that they're carrying their bags from places like Mississippi to Chicago and Detroit into those urban areas, places like South Carolina, North Carolina, going into New York, that this is a journey that we're on in Edgenetta's quilt, and we thank her for that. On our right is a quilt by April Anuship, who lives near Detroit, Michigan in Rochester Mills, and it's called Mama Rosa. And she is affectionately referring to Rosa Parks, who we know was responsible for getting tired of being tired and refusing to relinquish her seat on a bus that was in the section where that was reserved for whites in 1955. Rosa, being prepared to pay that dime that she had to pay to get on the bus, like all the passengers there, refused to not have a seat and to sit in the section that she did, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks here is featured in her older years, and she has accomplished much in being very loyal to the civil rights movement. So when we look at these two quilts, we are looking at uncovering the stories of civil rights and uncovering the stories that have led to our human understanding of how important the continuum of quests for civil rights, not only in the 1950s into the 1960s, but has ranged from the 1700s in this country to the present day. So we thank these two artists for their focus on these two moments. Next, we have the work of Glendora Simpson, who is from East Orange, New Jersey, called Traveling Shoes. And once again, we have the feature of travel. We have the feature of movement. Specifically special to Roanoke, Virginia, is a Pullman Porter's Museum. In the bottom half of this quilt called Traveling Shoes, we see the Southern Central Railroad car being manned by a Pullman porter who will see to it that the people get on the train and have safe passage. It is these Pullman porters who were organized in a union by A. Philip Randolph, who then give us this opportunity to look at networking of people who are assisting people traveling. Even bands like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway speak of the Pullman porters and how important they were to safe passage and to knowing where it was safe and where it wasn't safe for you to be. When we see that Glendora has featured suitcases, the Pullman porter's hats, the traveling shoes, she is speaking to a people who are moving for the purpose of building their lives, rebuilding the spaces that they will then take up, and taking a chance and a risk on what they will meet, but having purpose in going there. She also features an American flag, which lets us know that this is no arbitrary space, that this is America, that these people are traveling in, and it is significant that they are banding their lives by this motion. On our right is another quilt that is done by Viola Burley Leak, who is from Washington, D.C. and it's called Celebrating Barack Obama. When we think about Viola, who I also got the opportunity to meet, we see a very vibrant, alive person who really believes firmly in the quest for telling stories through the arts. She studied under the man who is called the father of art from the Harlem Renaissance, Aaron Douglas. And you can see some of the similarities of her methodology from comparing his work with hers. And she confides that he was one of her mentors. And so this opportunity to look at how deliberate she is in framing this moment of celebrating the election of the 44th president, Barack Obama, gives us some eye into how Viola thinks. She speaks to the stars as representing in this quilt the other presidents that have preceded Barack Obama. She gives them this halo over the White House. She also does not let us forget, in our historical forgetting, sometimes we do, the chains that had to be broken with the participation of the African American, thus the Black and white images that are there, thus the man with a gun for representing those veterans who have served in all of the wars from the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, First World War, and Second World War in this country that get us to this moment. She highlights that America is this phoenix rising from its own ashes in this quilt. At the bottom, we see a figure, Martin Luther King and the American flag, and the iconic slave ship. In this story that she is telling us, it adds up to how we think about a Barack Obama being possible in America. And so in her celebration, we can join her in this journey and look at his image in this quilt and see that there is some hope, there is some joy, there is some space for people of diverse backgrounds to be in positions in America to be powerful and be impactful. Last but not least, in this scheme of what is in the exhibition that you can see if you are able to come to the exhibit, it has been on view from February 1st, and it will continue through April. It is uncovering the Black experience in the 21st century that is a part and segment of this exhibition. And in that, we have the highlight of a quilt by Carolyn Crump, who is from Houston, Texas. She is a designer, a graphic illustrator of great skill and expertise. And we can see that illustrated in the quilt here called Waiting to Have My Say. During the tumultuous times of being in the period of lockdown with COVID, many things were manifested during that time. We had a peel back of more of the onion of what our societal ills were, what our violence had produced, and what protests were being mounted. In this quilt, she is talking about having her voice heard, that this is an America that's supposed to have space for her voice. And she is with others looking at the Declaration of the Rights of Humanity that gives us this place not only to exist, but to be heard, to occupy space in a way that helps us advance our humanity. And so she's presented in this quilt the scales of justice, the gavel of judgment, a person in bars, and the question of whether he is being unjustly treated. In that Declaration of Human Rights of the UN, it gives us some 30 guidelines that this quilt would be one of the articles. It would actually be supporting one of the articles of that document that help us to understand that we are all equals, or should be, that equality should be not something that's illusory or something out there for someone else, but that equity, that our promise of the Constitution should be in our grasp to have. And so we thank Carolyn for this powerful quilt, helping us to ask some of the questions that are represented by the man behind the bars. On my right here is a quilt by Donna Chambers, who is from Irvington, New York. No justice, no peace, which was a cry of many of the protests that we were able to see in 2020 and 2021 of young people who were raising their fists, who were looking at a cry not only to be heard, but spurred on by the advents of the demise of George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and others who made the cry that Black Lives Matter, who emphasized, as Donna has in this quilt, that if we do not have justice, there can be no peace. That raised fist is intentional and is helping to determine and point our eyes to a hopeful solution that we have to figure out together to raise humanity. The continuing work of Dr. Carolyn Maslomy and her quilt collection is an honor to behold, to know that it will become a part of the archives of American history, that it will become a part of the art document that informs that history, that tells some of the hidden stories that are not possible otherwise, but that it captures the work of people who were determined, despite the obstacles, to triumph. I ask you, is there a Black aesthetic? And our African American quilts are part of that aesthetic. I think I've come up with an answer, and I hope you agree with me, that yes, most certainly. Dr. Maslomy has given her life as a mission to help us understand the importance of this work of quilters, their hands, their machines, their mediums that they work in, and the variety of their voices, to not be forgotten, to not be overlooked, to not be ignored, but be acknowledged in this American history. I want to say thank you to Dr. Maslomy for her work. I do want to point out that I am honored to be collected in her collection that's not in this show, but to my left here, I wanted to share my work on a man whose name is Robert Smalls, who was enslaved during the Civil War, who turned over a boat called the Planter, filled with ammunition from the Confederate forces to the Union Army, was heralded for that, awarded to be a captain of the then turning that boat into the USS Planter by Abraham Lincoln. And he went on to then secure for 5 terms a place as a representative in Congress. That this quilt is now a part of the Winrick Gallery of the Smithsonian collection, and that coming in June is an honored exhibition that Dr. Carolyn Maslowny will be in, Faith Ringgold, Emma Amos, Consuela Jimenez Underwood, and myself at the Renwick, our National Smithsonian Craft Gallery. And you are all invited. June 1st, the first week of June, I think it's June 6th and 7th, there will be a reception. But we want to say that because of the work of Dr. Maslowny, America has had to pay attention in its national collection with the value and the presence of quilts. Thank you. And now I'd like to open our viewing space here to any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Lamerchi, so much. Are there any questions in the audience for Lamerchi?
Did anybody put anything in the chat?
I don't see anything in the chat. So. Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about the pieces behind you?
Oh, those are just some of my works in progress. As a quilter, I have this wall that I work in. I'm actually in my studio, which is my living room, dining room, because we have to work where we can, especially since COVID happened. The works that are there, one of them is over my right shoulder, is a work about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and it is on the cover of Dr. Carolyn Maslowny's publication, And Still We Rise. It highlights a woman who was born in like 1825. She was not only born free in Maryland and was educated at her uncle's school for colored children, but she became a representative for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. She was an orator, an author, a suffragist, and she even knew John Brown's wife and tried to support her through John Brown's trial and execution for his work, for his actions at Harper's Ferry. She was a very devoted woman to the rise of the race. And she talked about not being, though she knew that gender was a challenge in terms of voting rights and other rights for women, she said she couldn't actually separate herself out of being a part of the race and wanted the equal treatment of women among men, and raised her voice for the equality of the entire race. So she was a very skillful woman. She lived until 1912. So she lived a long life, and her books and her plays are very available for your reading pleasure. But I thought she was very special in her work. I called her the Bronze Muse, in that her work was tireless, and America was able to reflect from some of her speeches that were carried in the newspapers. She was on platforms with Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and others of her time who had important messages, who had important challenges to bigotry and the institution of slavery. So it was my delight to create that quilt. And on my shoulder on this side, there is an image that I think you can see of a young man who's in dreaded hair. I can't seem to get that, so you could be able to see it better. But He's making a holler and an intentional holler across space. And he's actually done in ink. And I'm doing that to then fabricate him in cloth. So thank you for asking that question. It just is one of the things that's in the studio right now that is a work in progress.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, there's a question up.
I don't know like how well I'm gonna be able to articulate this, but to your question about whether there is a Black aesthetic and thinking about the
I can't hear you. Can you speak up or?
I'll repeat the question once.
Thank you.
and kind of thinking about how the quilts have more of a focus on the experience, like the Black experience in the United States, and kind of like extending the idea of the Black aesthetic to other experiences, like as part of that. So that I'm connecting that. This is a really.
I'm not sure I'll remember all of your question, but in thinking about the Black aesthetic, how that translates into other experiences.
But more Pan-Africanist experiences beyond America.
Okay, Pan-African experiences beyond America.
Or I don't know if that's.
Absolutely. People of African descent have been taken to many places in the world, migrate and immigrate to many places in the world. And in spaces where colonialism and imperialism has been a part of the lands that they are then dwelling in, there is this deliberate force to be recognized that builds one's right to be. And so with the aesthetic meaning beauty, Black beauty has had to have its own force and dynamic. It has had to be an intentional placement. I recently visited the UK, the United Kingdom. I was in Iceland and Amsterdam. And there wasn't as sharp an edge as we have with the separation of races and the indications of separatism that I experienced when I was there, but it was still an undercurrent that I had to reckon with. Being visibly Black, being visibly, if you want to label it Pan-African, brings you to these spaces where slavery has had its impact and its racial theories that separate us from just normally moving about, if you will. So artists in the spaces that I've met have made a deliberate mission to be honored as human, to be honored in the spaces where injustice exists, to have justice. I went to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and I was able to witness there being a 30-foot bronze statue of a young Black woman in a Nike sweatsuit and Nike sneakers in the courtyard of that museum. When I went inside, there were sculptures or busts among the Greco-Roman busts of others that were now made by Prince Thomas, I believe is his name, that were featuring bronze busts with the curly hair, the broad nose, the open eyes of Black men among those Greco-Roman sculptures. And so the institutions that have been a part and parcel of this conversation of colonialism have now got to reckon with how there is mirroring, or there's the opportunity to mirror humanity, to mirror community in these spaces, a very formal presentation of European Western culture. So I am saying that there is, brought about by the protests, by the advance of history, the advance of correcting and repairing a narrative that has been a dominant in its expression of African being less than, of African being deficient, of African being having the lack of intelligence, as Thomas Jefferson and others who were supposed to be of the enlightened period, that these spaces now have to come to grips with, we have to do better. And some of them are making great attempts to do that, and some are not. So I am right now a congratulatory to Hollins University for bringing this exhibit that will help people to ask questions in its spaces of what is justice, what is the repair we need, where are the solutions to where we are going in the future, and who will hold that. I think the students who are in this university have a baton to carry in this race or this journey or this mapping of where we need to go. And that these are the critical questions that we keep having to answer and having to pose, and then hopefully find solutions to.
Thank you. Any other questions in the audience? Yes, one more.
Hi, this
Hi.
is more of a process question. How detailed or concrete of a plan do you have when you're going into a project? And how married are you to that during your artistic construction? Does the project ever, take on a life of its own, like the story you're trying to tell speaks to you during the process in a way that changes it?
Okay. All right. I didn't hear all of it. Would you mind reiterating the question for me?
Try.
You can.
So during the process, when you're in the middle of your idea, does the idea ever take over and change what you're trying to do? Is that,
The story, yeah, the story-wise, in
does
terms
it-
of what you're trying to represent.
does the story change during your process of making a piece?
Well, I will speak for myself and hopefully represent some of the other artists. As Dr. Carolyn Maslomi has said that many of the artists who are the quilt makers who are in these projects that you're talking about are self-taught, which means we also are experimental. So as we're working, if something occurs that we did not expect, we can either take that which has presented itself to us and make something of it, or try to make whatever we were trying to do, force it to conform. I find real joy in uncovering a new process or a new thing that I didn't expect to happen. And sometimes I speak to some of the dreams I have, and I'll wake up and I have a piece of paper and I'll write it down, even a napkin sometimes, just to capture that thing so I won't forget it. And maybe I'll try it out. Or maybe it is a not by design as my initial project, but it enters and makes it better. And I have had that happen several times. Currently, I am in a sculptural project for a fire station that has taken my quilt designs in concentric circles to present in perforated metal, concentric circles that represent the community, the buildings, the firefighters on these rings. And when I first entered into this project, I knew that I wanted to do something that would be in the voice that I wanted to speak to, but I also knew that I needed to speak to the voices of the firemen who have to come to that firehouse every day. What would they like to see? What would be encouraging to them as people who are taking care of us in our community? What would the community want to see? And what would be a permanent piece on the walls there? How would that resonate in my voice as an artist? So I didn't expect the process as I was working through it to come to the concentric circles that I use in my work as symbols of ongoing vibrating essence of ourselves, our souls, the universe, the solar system, these concentric circles that wrap around each other that keep going, a drop of water. I did not expect that, but it happened. And I was very happy about that. Sometimes we do experiment and they don't turn out exactly like we want to. And so then we have to think about how do we make a lemonade out of that lemon? But by and large, and for the most part, things usually wind up being very helpful. That those surprises that we get, and they inspire you to keep going because sometimes you have a plan and then there's a better plan. So you have to learn how to listen and submit sometimes to something that's greater than your own voice.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered you. I hope I did. But I'm just. Okay.
Lori, did you have a question? Okay, any other questions? Anything online? No, okay. Well, Amerchi, we just can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk and also for again stepping in for Carolyn when
I would do it any day for her. She's just a wonderful human being, and one to be honored in America, on and on and on, for her courageous work and her sense of organization. And I'm hoping that some of the students who are listening here in the audience and afar will take on the challenge of helping us to keep these kind of messages going that will promote change and transformation in our society. We're at a crisis state and we need you.
Well, thank you again. Thanks so much. I would take for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Okay. Thank you.
I know you have a busy month. Good luck with the rest of the month.
Whew, it's still going. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.